The mall smelled like cinnamon and pine resin, and the particular warmth of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Tinsel caught the light from every angle. A choir of children in matching red scarves stood near the fountain, their mouths open in practiced unison, filling the atrium with something that was supposed to feel like joy. For everyone else, maybe it did. Claire Whitmore sat on a bench near the east corridor, her coat still buttoned, her bag on her lap, a single sheet of paper folded in her hand. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times in the last hour that the creases had gone soft. Red ink bled along the margins. Not corrections, not suggestions, but dismissals. The kind of marks that don't invite improvement. The kind that say, "Don't come back." She had come to the mall because she didn't know where else to go. Her apartment would be too quiet. A specific kind of quiet that turns into a conversation with yourself you don't want to have. Her phone had 2 unread messages from her mother, and she couldn't bring herself to open either of them. The messages would be kind, her mother was always kind, and kindness right now would undo her completely. So she sat here, in the noise and the warmth. Anonymous among the holiday shoppers and the laughing families and the couples carrying matching paper bags, invisible in the way that only truly lonely people can be invisible in a crowd. She was 27 years old. She had a degree she'd worked 3 jobs to pay for. She had a portfolio that 2 separate design firms had described as promising before showing her the door. She had approximately $400 in her checking account, a lease renewal notice she had not signed, and a deep, bone-level exhaustion that sleep no longer touched. She unfolded the paper one more time, stared at the red marks. Not the right fit at this time. The choir finished their song. Applause scattered through the atrium like light rain. "Can I sit with you?" Claire looked up. A little girl stood in front of her, maybe 6, maybe 7, with dark blonde hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails and a coat that was clearly expensive in the way that children's clothing sometimes is when money is not a concern. She had wide brown eyes and the particular solemnity of a child who has spent a lot of time around adults and has absorbed some of their gravity without losing any of her own brightness. She was already sitting down by the time Claire answered. Claire Whitmore had been applying for jobs for 4 months, not casually. Not with the relaxed optimism of someone who has options and is simply waiting for the best one. She had applied with the systematic desperation of someone who has done the math and found that the numbers do not work. She had a spreadsheet, color-coded, organized by date and company and contact name and current status. It had taken her 3 hours to build, and she updated it every single day. 43 applications, 11 first-round responses, 6 second-round interviews, 3 final-round interviews. 0 offers. She had told herself, at 23, that the industry would recognize her eventually. At 25, she had told herself she just needed 1 more year of experience. At 27, she had stopped telling herself things and started simply doing the next thing, sending the next application, preparing for the next interview, pressing forward with the mechanical persistence of someone who has run out of optimism but has not yet run out of will. The city in December was cruel in a specific way. Every window she passed was warm and lit. Every shop she walked by had something to offer, something bright and wrapped and desired. The holiday season, which she had loved as a child with uncomplicated wholeness, had become a kind of background accusation. Everyone else is celebrating, and you have not yet earned the right to celebrate. Her roommate, a dental hygienist named Brooke, had offered to lend her money 3 times. Claire had refused 3 times. Not from pride, exactly, or not only from pride, from a belief, which she held on to with both hands, that accepting help she could not return would create a debt of feeling that would outlast any financial debt, and she did not want to look at Brooke across the kitchen table carrying that weight. So she kept the spreadsheet current and sent the applications, and told herself the next one might be different. The rejection this morning had been the worst, not because it was the most cutting, but because she had wanted this one. The Hartwell Group was exactly the kind of place she had built her whole portfolio toward, a mid-sized design consultancy with a reputation for serious work and serious clients. The kind of place where she could actually learn something. The kind of place that would mean something on her resume, not because of prestige, but because of substance. Because the work they did was real, integrated, purposeful, the kind that required you to actually understand something about the world rather than simply knowing how to operate software. She had spent 2 weeks preparing for the interview. She had researched their projects going back 7 years, studied their aesthetic philosophy through every piece of public-facing work she could find, rebuilt her portfolio presentation from scratch 3 separate times, until the sequence felt honest rather than strategic. She had borrowed her roommate's blazer, charcoal gray, excellent cut, slightly too long in the sleeve, but better than anything Claire owned, and worn her only pair of heels, and walked into that building on the 31st floor with everything she had. She had, she thought, been good, not perfect. She had stumbled once on a question about client management because she had limited experience with clients and had said so honestly rather than inventing something plausible, but the rest had been genuine. She had answered from real knowledge and real thought and the particular conviction that comes from caring about a subject rather than needing to impress someone about it. The HR manager, a thin man named Douglas with a face like a closed door, had looked at her portfolio for approximately 4 minutes before saying, with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers bad news professionally, that they were looking for someone with more industry experience. But how do you get industry experience? Claire had said, very carefully. If no one gives you the chance to get it. Douglas had not answered. He had smiled the smile of a man who had heard this question many times and had long since stopped caring about it. He had handed her the folder with the red marks and shown her to the elevator. The folder. She had stared at it in the elevator, 6 floors down, 7, 8. The city revealing itself floor by floor through the glass. Red marks on a portfolio she had spent 14 days building. Not suggestions. Dismissals. The marks of someone who had already decided and was merely going through the form of justifying the decision. The lobby had been full of people. She had walked through them to the exit and out into the cold December air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with no particular plan. The Hartwell Group. She had looked it up again on her phone while riding the elevator down. 31st floor in the Meridian Tower. Annual revenue of approximately $400 million. Parent company. Hartwell Consolidated Holdings. CEO and majority shareholder. A man named Ethan Hartwell, who appeared in exactly 2 photographs on the company's public-facing pages, both grainy, both taken from a distance, both offering nothing more than a tall man in a dark coat, standing with the ease of someone who does not particularly require documentation. She had stuffed the paper in her bag and walked out into the December cold and not known what to do next. That was how she'd ended up here, on this bench, in this mall, with the choir and the tinsel and the smell of cinnamon and the soft, aching feeling of a person who has tried very hard and has run out of ways to try harder. She was still holding the folder when the little girl sat down. "My name is Sophie," the girl said, with the directness of someone accustomed to being in charge of conversations. "I'm 6, almost 7. I'm Claire. I know you're sad," Sophie said. "Your face is doing the sad thing." Claire looked at this child, her steady brown eyes, her slightly crooked pigtails. The small crease of concern between her brows and, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just slightly. "Yeah," she said. "A little sad. Okay." Sophie nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I can stay for a while. My dad is buying coffee. He takes forever at coffee." Claire almost smiled. "How long does it take?" "So long," Sophie said gravely. "Last time it took forever and a half." And there it was, the smile, arriving without permission. The first one in what felt like days. Sophie settled onto the bench with the ease of someone who had never once worried about whether she was welcome somewhere. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets and looked around the atrium with an evaluating expression, like a very small general surveying terrain. "Why are you sad?" she asked, not unkindly. Just directly. The way children ask things before they've learned that directness can be mistaken for rudeness. I had a hard day, Claire said. What happened? I had an interview. For a job. And they said, no. Sophie considered this. Was it a good job? I thought so. Did you really want it? Then that's the worst kind of no, Sophie said. She said it with such quiet certainty that Claire felt oddly comforted by it, not because it helped, but because it was true, and someone had acknowledged that it was true, even if that someone was 6 3/4. How do you know about that kind of thing? Claire asked. Sophie shrugged one shoulder. Dad talks about work stuff sometimes when he thinks I'm not listening, but I'm always listening. A pause. He says the best things. What kind of things? Sophie's expression shifted, thoughtful, a little proud. The way children look when they're about to repeat something they've memorized because they loved it. He says that the people who say no the most are usually the most afraid. He says fear makes people miss things. She looked at Claire. Maybe they missed you. Claire looked at her. Something moved in her chest, not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope, which is a different, more fragile thing. Your dad sounds smart, she said. He is, Sophie said, without any boastfulness. Just a statement of fact. He's also pretty boring sometimes. He talks on the phone a lot. Claire laughed. An actual laugh, short and surprised. He's nice though, Sophie added. When he's not being boring. He taught me how to make pancakes. We do it on Sundays. She looked down at her hands. Mom doesn't live with us anymore. It's just me and Dad and Mrs. Finley, who watches me when Dad has meetings. The information arrived simply, without drama, the way children sometimes carry heavy things lightly because they haven't yet learned to treat them as heavy. That sounds like a good Sunday, Claire said gently. It is. Sophie looked up. Do you make pancakes? Sometimes. Not as often as I should. You should do it more. It helps. Sophie considered her own advice for a moment, apparently satisfied with it. What do you do? For jobs? I'm a designer. I make things look, I make things communicate. Like, I figure out how something should look so people understand what it is without having to be told. Sophie stared at her. So, you make invisible things visible? Claire blinked. Yes. That's actually exactly it. Dad would like that, Sophie said. Then, almost to herself, he likes people who see things other people don't see. A woman in a mall uniform walked past slowly, glancing at Sophie twice. Claire noticed, but thought nothing of it. What if you tried again? Sophie asked. I might have to. Not might, should. She tilted her head. What if you could meet the person in charge? Not the door person. The real person. It doesn't usually work that way. Sometimes it does, Sophie said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the choir begin to reassemble for a second song. Dad always says good people just need one chance. The problem is most places don't give enough chances. She glanced at Claire sideways. What if you could meet him again? The company that said no? Claire smiled, a little sadly. That's not really how it... Sophie's head turned. She had heard something Claire hadn't. In an instant, the focused, thoughtful child was replaced by something simpler, a 6-year-old who had spotted her father, her face going open and bright. He's here, she said, sliding off the bench. Then she stopped and looked back at Claire. I hope you get your chance, she said. I really do. She said it with such honest conviction that Claire believed her completely. Then she turned toward the entrance and the world shifted. 3 black SUVs had pulled up to the mall entrance in a line so smooth and coordinated it looked choreographed. Claire noticed the cars first. Then she noticed that the 2 men who had been standing near the coffee kiosk men she had vaguely registered as ordinary shoppers were no longer standing casually. They were standing with the particular stillness of people waiting for a signal. Then she noticed that the woman in the mall uniform who had walked past twice was now standing at the edge of the corridor, speaking quietly into something clipped to her collar. and then she noticed the other shoppers noticing. A kind of hush moved through the atrium, not complete silence. The music was still playing. The children were still chattering, but a shift in attention, a leaning toward, the way a room changes when something important enters it. The doors opened. 2 men in dark coats entered first, then a third. They moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who have been trained not to rush. They swept the immediate area with the kind of glance that takes in everything without appearing to look at anything at all. And then he walked in. He was tall, not unusually so, but he carried himself in a way that made the space around him feel organized. Dark coat, no tie, no visible effort toward appearance, and yet somehow appearing entirely deliberate. He was probably 35, maybe 38. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been designed for looking certain. He was scanning the crowd with calm, unhurried eyes. Then Sophie reached him. She launched herself at him with the abandon of a child who has never once doubted her welcome, and he caught her without breaking stride, lifting her in one smooth movement and holding her against his chest while she talked into his ear. Chairman Hartwell. The words came from the mall manager, who had appeared from somewhere and was now standing at a respectful distance, his hands clasped. Around them, 3 or 4 other mall employees had adopted postures that were not quite bowing but were definitely not casual. Claire felt the sound of those 2 words move through her like cold water. She looked at the line of black SUVs outside. She looked at the man holding Sophie. She looked at the folder on her lap, the red marks, the letterhead she had looked at 20 times today. Hartwell Group, a subsidiary of Hartwell Consolidated Holdings. The man turned, following whatever Sophie was pointing at, and his gaze found Claire with a directness that suggested he had already known exactly where she was before he looked. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, calm, dark, completely unreadable, stayed on her for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. Ethan Hartwell did not perform power. That was the thing Claire understood in the first 30 seconds of watching him move through the atrium. He didn't need to. He had the particular stillness of a person who has been the most important person in every room for long enough that it no longer registers as anything but ordinary. The mall manager was speaking to him. Ethan listened with the full, patient attention of someone who takes courtesy seriously, even when it costs him something. He nodded once, said something Claire couldn't hear. The manager practically glowed. Sophie was still in his arms, her chin hooked over his shoulder, watching Claire with unmistakable purpose. She's pointing at me, Claire realized. She's telling him about me. The thought was so strange that Claire almost stood up and left. She had her bag in her hand. She had half risen from the bench. Every reasonable instinct she possessed was pointing toward the east exit. She didn't leave. She couldn't explain why, afterward, except that Sophie's eyes were on her with an expression that could only be described as, "Stay." Ethan set Sophie down. He said something to her, and Sophie responded with great animation, one arm extended in Claire's direction. He looked at Claire again, not a glance this time, a look the kind that is an assessment, quiet and thorough and deliberate. Then he walked toward her, not fast, not slow. The men in dark coats adjusted their positions without a word. He stopped in front of her bench. Up close, he was more ordinary than he had seemed from a distance. Not softer, exactly, but more specific. There was something around his eyes that might have been tiredness, or might have been the permanent look of someone who thinks very hard about difficult things. "You spoke with my daughter," he said. "She sat down next to me," Claire said. "I hope she seemed fine." "She was very kind. She usually is?" A pause. "She tells me you had an interview today with the Hartwell Group." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a card. He held it out to her with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times. But his eyes, when he looked at her, were not the eyes of a man going through emotion. "Monday," he said. 9 a.m. Ask for my assistant. Give her your name." Claire stared at the card. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "A second interview," he said. "A real one." Sophie appeared at his elbow. She looked up at Claire with the expression of someone who has just watched a plan come together. "I told you," she said simply. Ethan Hartwell looked at his daughter with an expression that was the closest thing to helplessness Claire had seen on his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, softer at the edges. "We need to go," he said to Sophie. He turned and walked away, and Sophie gave Claire one last look, proud and certain, before following him. Claire sat very still with the card in her hand. She turned it over. Ethan Hartwell. Hartwell Consolidated Holdings. A phone number, an address. The logo she'd memorized from the website. Clean, black, geometrically precise. Her phone buzzed. Her mother's message. She opened it this time. "How did the interview go, honey?" She looked at the card. "Better than expected," she typed back. "I'll explain later." The 31st floor of Meridian Tower looked different on a Monday morning. Or maybe it was Claire who looked different. She had spent the entire weekend in a state of focused preparation that was also, underneath, a state of something she refused to name as hope. Hope had failed her often enough that she had learned to keep it at a careful distance. To work without letting the work become about hope, because when hope came in too close, it made the hands shake and the voice less steady and the answers less honest. She had rebuilt her portfolio again. Not rebuilt it, she had edited it, which is harder. Removed things until only the truest things remained. The process was counterintuitive. Every instinct said to add, to fill every gap, to present the fullest possible picture. But she kept thinking about what Sophie had said. He likes people who see things other people don't see. Seeing required clarity. Clarity required subtracting everything that cluttered the view. She took out 6 pieces that were technically impressive and left in 3 that were genuinely hers, even where they were imperfect. She had written answers to questions she expected him to ask. Then she had thrown those answers out, because she realized halfway through writing the second draft that written and rehearsed answers had a sound, a particular smoothness, a controlled quality that very attentive people could hear as plainly as she could hear traffic. She did not know much about Ethan Hartwell, but she knew from the shape of his decisions and the structure of what he had built that he was very attentive and that he listened to the thing under the words. She had gone through every public record she could find about his professional history. Not the articles written about him, those were thin, mostly financial analyses from trade sources that cared about revenue and not about the person making choices, but the choices themselves. The companies acquired and not acquired. The projects accepted and declined. The hires that had surprised the industry and the departures that had been swift and clean. She was building a picture not of a man, but of a mind, the shape of its priorities, the pattern of what it valued. What she found was this. He had been wrong less than almost anyone in his position, not because he was infallible, because he had thought carefully about every decision before making it, and had been willing to accept the cost of being right when everyone else was wrong, and had been patient about the payoff in a way that most people with his resources never are. He played a longer game than the situation seemed to require. She recognized this quality not because she had always played long games, she was 27 and had never had the luxury of patience, but because she had always wanted to, and there is a specific quality of recognition in seeing something you have longed for without knowing its name. She was standing in the lobby, having given her name to the assistant, a woman named Rachel, who was warm and efficient, and gave the impression of having seen everything without being surprised by any of it when the elevator opened. Ethan Hartwell was already inside it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good morning." He pressed the button for the 32nd floor, not 31, and said nothing else while the elevator rose. The silence was not uncomfortable the way silences between near strangers usually are. It had the quality of 2 people who have implicitly agreed to skip the part where they perform ease they don't yet feel. The 32nd floor was different. Quieter. The walls were glass on 2 sides, looking out over the city, and the city on a clear December morning looked like something deliberate, all angles and clean light, and the particular pure blue of cold sky that only arrives when the air has been scoured by overnight frost. There were no rows of workstations, no reception desk, no evidence of the regular machinery of corporate life. A round table, 2 chairs, no conference room, no panel, no HR presence. Good, she thought. This is the real conversation. Sit, he said, and sat down himself, and looked at her across the table with the same quality of attention he'd given her in the mall, complete, quiet, slightly unnerving. I don't do many of these, he said. Second interviews? Direct ones. I usually rely on my team's judgment. He paused. Sophie doesn't usually talk to strangers. She seemed to find the situation self-explanatory. Something moved in his expression. Yes, she does that. A pause. Tell me why you want to work for the Hartwell Group. She had a prepared answer for this. She had rehearsed it over 2 days. She discarded it now, because it was the wrong kind of answer for this kind of man, and she had spent enough time studying his decisions to know that he valued the true thing over the polished thing. Because the work is real, she said. Most design work is decoration. What your companies do with design, the way it integrates into function, that's communication at the level I want to work at. I don't want to make things pretty. I want to make things clear. She paused. I believe those are different things. Most employers don't. He was quiet for a moment. What's the hardest failure you've had in your career? He asked. She told him the truth. Not the rehearsed version, the version you tell when someone has already made clear they can hear the difference. She told him about the project at her last job, 2 years ago, when she had been so certain she was right about a design direction that she had pushed for it past the point where pushing made sense, and the project had failed, and she had had to sit with the knowledge that she had contributed to that failure through stubbornness she'd called conviction. What did you learn? He asked. That being right about the idea doesn't mean you're right about the timing, she said. That conviction is only useful if it's connected to something outside yourself. He sat with that for a moment. He had the habit of sitting with things, not processing them so much as letting them settle, the way a judge lets testimony land before responding. My daughter said you make invisible things visible, he said. She got there before I did. She usually does. He turned to look at the window, the city, the light. I started in graphic production. In a print shop, 20 years ago, I was 22. I had none of the things required for the position I eventually wanted. Claire looked at him. The person who hired me, he continued, didn't care about what I had. He cared about what I understood. He gave me 1 year. He turned back to her. He got 15 before I bought the company. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Most people, he said, tell me what they think I want to hear. In that chair, in that room, you didn't. You didn't seem like someone who wanted that. I don't. To do work that matters, to get better at it. And eventually, she stopped herself. Eventually to lead something, a team, a department. I know that's not. It's not off the table, he said. The objection came from the room Claire was not in. She learned this later from Rachel, who told her with the careful neutrality of someone maintaining professional discretion, while also being, clearly, a human being with opinions. The board had concerns. Specifically, 4 members of the senior design leadership team, who had reviewed Claire's portfolio and found it promising but thin. Promising, they said, was not sufficient for the role Ethan appeared to be considering. The usual process existed for reasons. Experience benchmarks existed for reasons. Standards existed for reasons. What did he say? Claire asked. Rachel's expression did not change. He said he'd take responsibility for the outcome. 4 words. Simple. Declarative. No qualification, no hedging, no committee speak. Claire thought about that for a long time. She had worked in enough places to know that those 4 words, in a corporate context, were not nothing. They were a transfer of personal stake. They meant, if this is wrong, I own it. Not the process, not the committee, not the circumstances, me. She had not been in the room, but she understood what had happened there. A man who could have done anything had chosen to put his name next to hers. She spent the rest of that afternoon at a coffee shop around the corner from Meridian Tower, unable to go home, working through the designs she would have shown if she'd been given more time. She filled half a notebook. When she looked up, it was dark outside and her coffee had gone cold. Her phone rang. It was Rachel. "Miss Whitmore. Mr. Hartwell wanted me to let you know." A brief pause. "You'll receive the formal offer by end of day tomorrow. He asked me to tell you the role is Design Director for Strategic Initiatives. He thought you should know the full title before you decide." Claire set the phone down very slowly. Design Director. Not Associate. Not Junior. Not Assistant to. Director. She thought about the folder with the red marks. She thought about Douglas and his closed-door face. She thought about 43 applications and the particular exhaustion of trying very hard for a very long time. She thought about Sophie on the bench, her uneven pigtails, her voice carrying the weight of something too large for 6 years old. Good people just need one chance. She called her mother. "I got the job," she said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me everything." The work was harder than she had expected, and she had expected it to be hard. That was the first thing she understood about the Hartwell Group. The culture was not cruel, but it was serious. People here had been doing this for a long time, and they were good at it, and they had the particular impatience of people who are good at things for colleagues who are not yet good at things. Not malicious, just calibrated to a standard she had to grow into. She was the youngest person in her department by 4 years. She was also, she was fairly certain, the most junior person to hold a director title in the company's recent history. She was fine with that. She understood what it meant and what it cost. She had not been given an easy path here. She had been given a steep one with someone's reputation riding on her at the top of it. She thought about that sometimes in the early mornings before the office filled, sitting at her desk with her coffee, the city still dark outside the windows. Someone had said, "I'll take responsibility for her," and she intended to make that a good decision. She had grown up calibrating to standards, the kind of childhood where money was careful and expectations were not gentle, and you learned early that effort was not a virtue. It was a requirement, just the baseline, the floor you started from, not the thing that earned you credit. She knew the feeling of working at the edge of your ability for extended periods. She knew the specific quality of effort required when you cannot afford to coast. She had been doing it her whole life. The difference here was that the standard was genuinely high, which meant that when she met it, it would mean something. Her direct manager was a man named Gregory Walsh, late 40s. Methodical, suspicious of intuition in the way that precise people sometimes are of less precise ones. He reviewed her first project proposal with the thoroughness of someone looking for reasons to revise it, line by line, with a red pen that felt almost ceremonially familiar given recent events. He found 3 things worth changing. They were all correct. She revised accordingly, without argument, because he was right. She did not ask why each change had been made. She could see why, and asking would have implied she needed it explained. She simply made the revisions and resubmitted. The second proposal came back with 1 note, a single, marginal comment about source hierarchy that she had genuinely not considered. She revised. She understood the thinking behind the note well enough to apply it to 2 other places in the document before it could be flagged. The third proposal came back clean. Gregory Walsh said nothing about this. He was not a man who commented on gradients of improvement, having apparently concluded long ago that doing good work was its own sufficient statement, and praise was an unnecessary addition. But the following week he included her in a briefing she had not been invited to before a senior client planning session for a company she had been researching on her own time, and she understood that this was, in his language, a very high form of approval. Ethan Hartwell she saw twice in the first 2 weeks, once in the elevator, once at a Monday morning leadership meeting she attended as a quiet observer at the back of the room, a position she had requested from Rachel, specifically because she wanted to understand the rhythm of the organization before attempting to contribute to it. Both times Ethan acknowledged her with the same courteous brevity he gave everyone. A nod, a glance, nothing warmer and nothing colder. She was professional about this. She was also honest with herself, which is different. She noticed him, the way she had noticed, in the mall, that there was something specific in the way he held his daughter, not the performance of a father being observed, but the private ease of a man whose child is the thing in his life that most completely makes sense. The way she had noticed, in the interview room, that he listened with his whole attention, not just the surface of it. She filed this information away in the part of herself that was not professional, and did not look at it, and focused on her work. But Sophie called, not to Claire's phone. She had not given Sophie her number. But she left a drawing on Rachel's desk with a note that said, "For the new lady with the sad folder," and Rachel had brought it to Claire's office with the suppressed smile of someone in possession of a very good piece of information. It was a drawing of two people on a bench. One had yellow hair and a sad face and a folder. The other had pigtails. Above them, Sophie had written, "She got her chance." Below the bench, she had drawn what appeared to be stars. Claire put it on her wall. It happened on a Thursday, 6 weeks in a way that was entirely accidental, and also, possibly, not accidental at all. Claire had been working late. Not from anxiety, she was past the stage of working late from anxiety and had reached the stage of working late because she was genuinely absorbed. She was building the design framework for a new client presentation, and she had reached that zone where time becomes flexible. She came out of the elevator at 7:45 p.m. to find Ethan Hartwell standing in the lobby with Sophie in a winter coat and an expression of mild territorial displeasure on his small face. "Mrs. Finley is sick," Ethan said, apparently to no one, or perhaps to the lobby in general. "I'm hungry," Sophie added. To Claire specifically, with the directness of someone who knows a useful variable when she sees one. "I was going to order something in," Ethan continued. He glanced at Claire with the look of a man who has just noticed he is about to ask something and is deciding whether to ask it. She had not eaten since noon. She thought about the drive home, the empty apartment, the probably empty refrigerator. "No," she said. A pause. "There's a place across the street," he said. "If that's," he stopped, started again. "Sophie likes their pasta. It's the best," Sophie confirmed. She had already taken Claire's hand. Claire looked down at the small hand in hers, certain, warm, entirely at ease. "Okay," she said. The place across the street was small and warm, and the kind of old that means it has been reliable for a very long time. The owner greeted Ethan by name and Sophie with the particular warmth reserved for regulars who are also delightful children. They were seated in a corner booth, Sophie between them, immediately occupied with the paper menu she was too young to fully read but studied with great seriousness. It was not a date. Claire was careful about this clarity, not because it needed to be stated, but because she needed to hold it in her mind clearly, the way you hold something fragile. It was dinner. It was a circumstance. But Ethan Hartwell, freed from the context of the office, was a different quality of person. Not different in substance, still precise, still unhurried, but there was more texture to him. He talked to Sophie with full attention, not the distracted half-attention of a busy parent, but genuine interest in the things she cared about. He asked her opinion on her pasta. He listened to a 12-minute account of something that had happened at her music lesson with apparent complete engagement. At one point, Sophie said, "Dad, Claire makes invisible things visible." And Ethan looked at Claire across the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to warmth. "I know," he said. "How do you know?" Sophie demanded. "I read her work." Sophie considered this. "Good," she said. She went back to her pasta. Claire and Ethan looked at each other for one moment longer than necessary. Not long, just one beat. A single measure of something unspoken, and then they both looked away in different directions, and the moment closed. Nothing was said about it. Nothing needed to be. 3 months in, Claire was given the Aldwych account. This was not, technically, hers to be given. The Aldwych Group was the Hartwell portfolio's most prestigious long-term client. a global architecture firm whose communications had been handled by the senior design team for 11 years. 11 years is not a client relationship, it is an institution. The senior design team had 3 people on it, all of whom had been at Hartwell longer than Claire had been in the industry. Gregory Walsh had recommended her anyway. "You see things we've stopped seeing," he said, with the candor of someone who has reached the point where honesty is more efficient than professional pride. "We've been too close to this work for too long." Fresh eyes, a pause. The problem with knowing something very well is that eventually you stop asking questions about it. She understood what it meant. She also understood the pressure it created, because the Aldwych people were serious and did not like change, and had opinions about design the way architects have opinions about architecture, which is to say, deeply and specifically, and with a technical vocabulary. She would have to earn the right to speak before she could challenge it. She spent 2 weeks reading before she drew a single line. Every piece of published work Aldwych had done in the last 5 years. Every article written about their projects, every award citation, every professional profile, every interview where someone from the firm had explained what they believed about space and light and the relationship between a building and the person standing inside it. She was building a mental map of who they were, not who they said they were, which any company's communications already expressed, but what they had not yet said. The space between self-presentation and actual work, where the truest things often lived. The presentation was in the large conference room on the 31st floor. The Aldwych team was 4 people. Ethan was present, not participating, just present. In the back of the room, in the way he sometimes appeared at significant client meetings without announcement. She was not nervous. This surprised her. She was focused, which is different, a narrowing of attention to a single point, everything irrelevant falling away. She presented for 40 minutes. She showed them a design language that was not a departure from their existing identity, but an evolution of it, something that honored what they had built over 11 years while making visible what they had not yet found language to say about themselves. The lead from Aldwych, a woman named Patricia Worth, was quiet for a long time after Claire finished, the kind of quiet that in a conference room can mean anything. Then she said, "How long have you been studying us?" 2 weeks, Claire said. "It feels like more," Patricia Worth said. This was, Claire would learn later from Marcus Trent, among the highest compliments Patricia Worth gave. After the Aldwych team left, Ethan remained. The room had emptied, and it was just the 2 of them and the winter light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was allowing himself to feel something he had not planned to feel. "You did something in there," he said. "I showed them what they already knew." "No." A pause. "You showed them what they hadn't let themselves know yet." He turned back to the window. "That's different. That's harder." She waited. "Sophie drew you again," he said, without preamble or segue. "Did she? You're in every drawing she does now. You and the stars." He was quiet. She hasn't had, for a while someone she's chosen like that. The word chosen landed between them with a specific weight. "I'm glad," Claire said. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "So am I," he said. Spring came to the city the way it always does, gradually at first, then all at once. The trees in the park outside Meridian Tower had been bare for so long that Claire had stopped seeing them, and then one Monday morning they were no longer bare, and the whole world looked like something that had decided to begin again. She had been at the Hartwell Group for 5 months. The Aldwych relationship had expanded. Patricia Worth had requested Claire specifically for 2 follow-on projects, which in that world was as close to a standing ovation as the work ever got. Gregory Walsh had retired a third of his project load onto her shoulders, which was his way of saying she was ready, and she was. The board that had objected to her hire had not said anything further on the subject. 2 of them had nodded at her in the elevator last week with the specific gravity of men conceding a point they had once argued against, which from people of that particular type was essentially a formal apology. She had found, somewhere in the middle of it all, that she was not exhausted anymore. This was its own kind of revelation. She had been so accustomed to the exhaustion had worn it so long it had become structural, load-bearing, that its absence felt, at first, like something was missing. Then she realized. This was what it felt like to be doing the right work. Not easy work. Not unchallenging work, but work that was genuinely hers, that asked something real from her and gave something real back. She had lunch with Sophie on the last Saturday of every month. It had started, informally. Ethan had been in a meeting. Sophie had been with the driver, and Claire had been walking through the park, and they had simply found each other in the same place, at the same time, with the same hunger. Then it happened again, the next month, and the month after that. Now Sophie texted her through the supervised phone Ethan had given her. 3 words. Saturday, pasta place, always with a star at the end. Claire always said yes. She had come to understand Sophie in the way you understand someone who has never once been dishonest with you completely, without ambiguity. Sophie wanted a family that was whole again, or whole in a new configuration, and she had decided with characteristic decisiveness that Claire was the missing piece, and was proceeding accordingly. She did not hide this. Sophie did not hide things. She simply moved toward what she wanted with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be ashamed of wanting. It was not nothing what had developed between Claire and Ethan, but it was also not yet what it was moving toward, and they both understood this, and neither of them rushed it, because both of them had learned in different ways and at different costs that the thing you build carefully is the thing that holds. What it was, in practice. Attention. The kind that doesn't announce itself. He remembered details she had mentioned in passing a book she'd said she was reading, a project she'd been frustrated with, her preference for black coffee over any other kind. She noticed when he was tired, which happened with the specific tiredness of someone who carries a great deal without distributing the weight. She did not comment on it. She simply, on 3 separate occasions, left a cup of coffee on his desk when she passed his office in the late afternoon and said nothing about it. And he said nothing about it either, and yet somehow it communicated everything that needed communicating. She was in her office on a Friday afternoon in April when he knocked on the open door. "Working late again," he said. "Better lighting than my apartment," she said, which was only partially true. He came in and sat in the chair to the side of her desk, not the formal chair across from it, which was the chair for work conversations, but the one to the side, slightly angled toward the window, which she had long since identified as the chair he chose when what he wanted to say was not about work. She had noticed this months ago and had decided, with some effort, not to think about what it meant. "Sophie has a recital," he said. "Next Friday. The music school. I know. She told me about it in detail. Also sent me a 6-minute voice message about what she's going to wear." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but what lived adjacent to it in his particular emotional register. "She's been practicing the piece every evening. She plays it slowly, then she plays it fast, then she plays the hard part 17 times. Does she get it right by the 17th? Usually by the 14th. A pause. "She wanted me to ask if you could come." Claire looked at him. He was looking at the window. The particular care with which he was looking at the window suggested that the window was not actually what he was thinking about. "Did she want you to ask?" Claire said. "Or did you want to ask?" He turned from the window, met her gaze with the directness that was, she had come to understand, his most honest register, not warm exactly, but fully present, which for this man was precisely the same thing. "Both," he said. She felt it then, not dramatically, not with any cinematic clarity, but as a simple, quiet fact, arriving at its own unhurried pace. This person had become necessary to her in a way she had not planned and could not now undo, and she was not sorry about it at all. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded once. Started to stand. "Ethan." He stopped. She had not used his name like this before, not outside of professional contexts, not with this particular weight behind it, the weight of everything she meant and everything she was not yet saying. "Thank you," she said. "For the Monday. For the card." He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man who takes things seriously, and has taken this seriously for longer than either of them had acknowledged, who had been taking it seriously since a December afternoon when his daughter sat down next to a stranger on a mall bench and came back talking about someone who makes invisible things visible. "Thank you for staying on the bench," he said. She almost laughed. "I almost didn't. I know." Something moved through his expression, something that had been held carefully for a long time, held with the patience of someone who understands that the right moment is not the first available moment. "I'm glad you did." He left. She sat with the evening light coming through the window and the city below beginning its Friday migration, the long exhale of a week releasing itself into the weekend and the particular fullness of a life that has more in it than it used to. She thought about a December afternoon 5 months ago, the red marks, the choir, the cinnamon smell, the bench, the small voice asking with complete simplicity, "Can I sit with you?" She had thought, in that moment, that she was at the bottom. She understood now that she had been at the beginning. Sophie's recital was in a small auditorium that smelled like wood polish and old curtains, the particular smell of a place that has hosted many beginnings. There were 43 children in the program. Sophie was third from the left in the second row, in a navy dress and her hair, for once, miraculously properly done. She had texted Claire a photograph of it 3 hours before the recital. "Look at my hair." Mrs. Finley did it. "It's perfect." Claire had replied, "It is perfect. I'll be there." Sophie had sent back a single star. Claire sat beside Ethan. Not by accident. Sophie had designated seats with small paper place cards cut from a cereal box. Claire suspected, given the faint print on the reverse side, Dad on one, Claire on the other, the letters large and deliberate and surrounded, inevitably, by stars. They sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, the specific quality of another person's presence when you have learned to recognize it from a distance. The auditorium was full of parents with phones already raised, and grandparents who couldn't quite see, and younger siblings who didn't understand why they had to be quiet but were trying. When Sophie appeared on stage, she found them immediately, because Sophie always found the people she was looking for, having apparently been born without the uncertainty most people carry in their chest about whether they are wanted. She located Claire and Ethan in the third row, and the look on her face was complete and uncomplicated satisfaction, the expression of a person whose plan has come together exactly as intended. She played her piece with great seriousness and only one small mistake in the middle section, which she corrected without acknowledgement, pressing on with the composure of someone who has learned from a parent who does not linger on errors. Afterward, in the lobby, amidst the controlled chaos of 43 children being retrieved by their families, Sophie tugged on Claire's sleeve. "I told you," she said. "You told me what? That good people need one chance." She tilted her head. "I was right." Ethan, standing behind her, met Claire's eyes over Sophie's head. The look on his face was not complicated. It was the look of a man who has accepted something he had been holding at careful arm's length and who has found that accepting it feels less like surrender and more like relief, like setting down something heavy. You'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. "She's always right," he said. "So far," Sophie confirmed, and took both of their hands, one in each of hers, and pulled them toward the door with the authority of someone who has been managing this situation since December and is pleased with how it has resolved. Outside, the April evening was warm for the first time all year. The city was doing the thing it does in spring, loosening, brightening, suggesting that difficulty is not the permanent state of things. The trees in the small park across from the music school were in fresh leaf, that particular green that only exists for a few weeks before it deepens and becomes ordinary. Somewhere nearby there was the sound of a street musician, something slow and unidentifiable carrying through the warm air. Sophie walked between them, holding their hands, telling them about the piece she had played and the boy named Marcus who had been to her right and had rushed the final measure. And the way the piano felt different when there were people listening, like it was trying, like it wanted to be heard. Claire listened. Ethan listened. Neither of them said anything about the fact that they were walking together through the city in the spring evening. With Sophie between them, she was already thinking of her this way. Quietly, without pressure, the way you think about true things before they have names. Some things do not need to be announced in order to be real. Some things become real through the accumulation of small, ordinary moments. Dinners and drawings and December afternoons, and a seat on a bench taken by a child who saw something worth sitting next to. Claire thought about that afternoon sometimes, the red marks, the choir, the cinnamon smell, the loneliness of sitting in the center of a crowd. She thought about the very particular quality of hopelessness she had felt, the deep bone exhaustion of a person who has tried very hard for a very long time and has begun to wonder if trying is enough. She had been, she'd thought at the time, at the very bottom. She understood now that she had simply been at the place where the bottom ends and the floor begins, the moment just before something holds. A small voice beside her. "Claire? Yeah? Are you happy?" She looked down at Sophie, the uneven pigtails long since gone. The perfectly done hair from 3 hours ago already coming slightly loose at the left side, which somehow made it better. She looked at the city around them, the warm evening, the green trees. She thought about the office she went to every morning, the work that was genuinely hard and genuinely hers. She thought about the drawing on her wall, the stars, the 2 figures on the bench. She thought about Ethan, beside her, and did not need to look at him to know that he was there. "Yes," she said, "very." Sophie nodded, satisfied. She kept walking, still holding their hands, pulling them forward into the evening. All she had needed was one seat at the right table. The rest, she was building herself.